I should have seen it coming. The way Melissa's eyes had been narrowing at me all evening, the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, the forced smiles from her friends. But I was so focused on making sure everyone had enough food, that the wine glasses stayed full, that I missed the storm brewing in my own living room. It was supposed to be a celebration. Anthony had just landed a major contract for their digital marketing firm, and Melissa wanted to throw a party to show off their success. Of course, she asked me to help with the preparations. I spent 3 days cooking, cleaning, arranging flowers from the small garden I tended behind the house. At 67, my knees aren't what they used to be, but I wanted everything perfect for them. The guests were mostly Melissa's crowd, young professionals with expensive handbags and designer shoes, the kind of people who spoke loudly about their vacation homes and wine collections. I felt invisible among them, which was exactly how I preferred it. I'd learned long ago that staying in the background served me well, but invisibility, I discovered that night, can quickly turn into a target. It started when I was refilling the appetizer tray in the kitchen. I heard Melissa's voice rising above the chatter, though I couldn't make out her words. When I returned to the living room with fresh bruschetta, the conversation had shifted to something about family expectations and financial responsibilities. Several guests were nodding along sympathetically as Melissa gestured dramatically with her wine glass. Then she saw me approaching with the tray, and something in her expression shifted. It was like watching someone flip a switch. The sympathetic hostess disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized. She turned to her audience with that brittle smile she'd perfected over the years and said something that made my blood run cold. She told them how exhausting it was caring for someone who had never learned to take care of herself. How some people just expected to be taken care of their whole lives, moving from husband to son without ever contributing anything meaningful. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. Her friends murmured their understanding, shooting pitying glances in my direction. I stood there, holding that tray, feeling heat creep up my neck, watching my daughter-in-law perform my humiliation like dinner theater. She was just getting warmed up. The cruelest part was how she made it sound so reasonable, so justified. Poor Melissa, burdened with a mother-in-law who couldn't even afford her own place. Poor Anthony, supporting a mother who had never amounted to anything. The woman who spent her days playing in the garden instead of getting a real job, who wore the same old cardigans year after year, who drove that ancient Honda that barely started in winter. I wanted to disappear into the floor, but my feet seemed rooted in place. What happened next still feels like a blur even months later. One moment, I was standing there absorbing the weight of every cruel word, and the next, I was on the ground. Melissa had been gesturing with increasing animation, her wine glass cutting through the air as she described my many failings to her captivated audience. Whether she meant to push me or simply got carried away in her performance, I'll never know. But her hand connected with my shoulder just as I was turning to leave, and down I went. The bruschetta scattered across the hardwood floor. Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. I could feel every eye on me as I lay there, my hip screaming in pain, my dignity in pieces around me, like the broken crackers. For a moment, I thought about staying down, just lying there until someone called an ambulance, until this nightmare evening could end with me safely tucked away in a hospital bed somewhere. But then, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the way Melissa stood there, not even offering to help me up. Maybe it was the pitying looks from her friends, or the fact that my own son was nowhere to be seen when his mother needed him most. Whatever it was, it burned through me like fire, transforming embarrassment into something far more dangerous. I pushed myself up slowly, ignoring the sharp protest from my hip. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. When I finally stood and looked directly at Melissa, I saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, maybe even a hint of fear. Good. She should be afraid. My turn now, I told her quietly. Just wait. The words came out calm and measured nothing like the trembling I felt inside. Then I walked to the kitchen, retrieved my phone from where I'd left it by the sink, and dialed a number I knew by heart, but hadn't called in months. James answered on the second ring, his voice instantly alert, despite the late hour. He'd been my personal secretary for 15 years, managing the portfolio that had grown from my modest savings into something I could barely believe myself. Even in retirement, James handled my investments with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. I kept my voice low, but clear enough that anyone who happened to be listening would hear every word. I told James to prepare the withdrawal paperwork for the Martinez digital marketing account. All of it. $4.2 million to be exact. I wanted it moved to my discretionary fund by close of business the next day. The kitchen had gone completely quiet. I could sense bodies gathering in the doorway behind me, but I didn't turn around. James asked if I was certain about the timing, given the current market conditions. I assured him I'd never been more certain about anything in my life. When I finally ended the call and turned around, the entire party had crowded into the kitchen doorway. Melissa's face had gone white. Anthony stood behind her, his mouth hanging open like he was trying to catch flies. The look of dawning comprehension in their eyes was almost worth the bruised hip. The shocked silence that followed my phone call stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could practically hear the gears turning in their minds as they tried to process what they'd just witnessed. $4.2 million. Their company's primary investor. The old woman who clipped coupons and darned her own socks. I excused myself from the party that night, without another word, leaving behind a room full of confused guests and a daughter-in-law whose carefully constructed narrative had just crumbled around her designer heels. Let them figure it out for themselves. I had more important things to do than provide explanations to people who had never bothered to ask the right questions. The truth was, I'd been wealthy for longer than Anthony and Melissa had been married, longer than most of their friends had been alive for that matter. But wealth, I'd learned early on, changes how people see you. It changes how they treat you, how they talk to you, what they expect from you. And after watching what money had done to my first marriage, I'd made a deliberate choice to keep that part of my life separate from my family. My late husband, Robert, had been a good man, but he'd never understood money the way I did. When I started making more than him in my early 30s, working as a financial advisor for high net worth clients, he couldn't handle it. The arguments started small comments about my work hours, suggestions that maybe I was getting too ambitious for my own good, but they grew fed by his insecurity and his friends' opinions about women who forgot their place. By the time Anthony was born, I'd learned to keep my professional success quiet. I deposited my paychecks into accounts Robert never saw, made investments he never knew about. It wasn't deception, I told myself. It was preservation of my marriage, of our family stability, of my son's relationship with his father. After Robert died suddenly, when Anthony was 22, I could have revealed everything. Could have shown my son that his mother wasn't the simple housewife he'd always believed her to be. But by then, Anthony was building his own life, his own identity, separate from mine. He was proud of his independence, proud of taking care of his aging mother. How could I take that away from him? So I continued the charade. I let him believe I lived on Robert's modest life insurance, payout, and Social Security. I drove the old Honda shopped with coupons, wore the same clothes year after year. When Anthony insisted I move in with him and Melissa after they bought their house, I agreed. Not because I needed their support, but because I wanted to be close to them, to be part of their daily lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son's business success depended entirely on his supposedly indigent mother's secret investment. What Anthony and Melissa never knew was that I hadn't just invested in their company, I had essentially created it. When Anthony first came to me 5 years ago with his business plan, eyes bright with entrepreneurial dreams and a head full of ideas about digital marketing, I listened with the careful attention I'd once given to my wealthiest clients. His concepts were sound, his market analysis impressive, but his financial projections were wildly optimistic. He needed capital, real capital, not the small business loan he was hoping to qualify for. The kind of money that would let him hire experienced staff, lease proper office space, invest in the technology that would set him apart from every other 20-something with a laptop and a dream. But banks don't tend to bet big on untested ventures, even good ones. So I became his anonymous angel investor. Through a carefully constructed web of shell companies and legal entities that James helped me establish, I funneled money into Anthony's business. Not all at once, that would have raised questions. Instead, I let it flow in stages, disguised as contracts from clients who didn't exist, government grants that were mysteriously approved investor groups that materialized just when Anthony needed them most. Watching him succeed felt like watching a master gardener tend to a prized plant. Every quarter, I reviewed the financial reports that James discreetly obtained for me. Every milestone Anthony celebrated, every new client he landed, every employee he hired, all of it was possible because his mother, the woman he thought couldn't even balance her own checkbook, had quietly become his largest benefactor. Melissa never questioned their good fortune. If anything, she took credit for it, convinced that her business acumen and social connections were driving their success. She loved telling people at parties about the big contracts that seemed to fall into their laps, the investors who approached them out of nowhere, the way their company had grown from a kitchen table startup to a legitimate player in the digital marketing space. I let her believe it. I let them both believe it, because seeing my son's pride in his achievements, watching him build something he thought was entirely his own, was worth more to me than any recognition or gratitude they might have offered. But there's a difference between being generous and being foolish. Every dollar I invested came with legal protections, carefully worded contracts that James ensured would hold up in any court. I was a silent partner, yes, but I was still a partner. The money could be withdrawn at any time, for any reason, with 30 days' notice. Anthony had always assumed their mysterious benefactors were satisfied with the steady returns the company generated. He had no idea that the woman cooking his dinner every night could pull the plug on everything with a single phone call. Until now, I'd never wanted to use that power. But as I lay in my bed that night, my hip throbbing from the fall and my heart aching from the humiliation, I realized something important. Sometimes love means setting boundaries even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Melissa's voice describing me as a burden, a leech, a woman who had never learned to stand on her own feet. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was the grain of truth buried beneath them. I had been living in their house for 3 years. I had been letting them support me, at least on the surface. I had been playing the role of the dependent mother so thoroughly that I'd almost convinced myself it was real. By dawn, I'd made my decision. If Melissa wanted to see what it looked like when I truly took care of myself, I'd give her exactly that. I spent the morning in my small bedroom, the one that had been Anthony's childhood room, making lists. Phone numbers, addresses, account information, all the details of the life I'd kept hidden for so long. James would need to know my timeline. My attorney would need to prepare new documents. and I'd need to find somewhere else to live, somewhere that reflected who I actually was, rather than who I'd been pretending to be. The house hunting began that afternoon. I told Anthony and Melissa I was going for a drive to clear my head after the previous night's incident. They barely looked up from their laptops, too absorbed in damage control with their clients, to pay much attention to the old woman with the bruised hip. Perfect. Their indifference would make everything so much easier. I drove through the downtown area of Kansas City neighborhoods I'd admired from a distance, but never considered for myself. The Crossroads Arts District caught my eye. Immediately converted warehouses turned into lofts, tree-lined streets with boutique shops and coffee houses. The kind of urban sophistication I'd always been drawn to, but never allowed myself to pursue. The real estate agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who specialized in luxury properties, tried not to show her surprise when I inquired about the most expensive listings. I was still wearing my old cardigan and driving the ancient Honda after all. But when I mentioned I'd be paying cash and would need to close within 2 weeks, her demeanor shifted dramatically. The third property she showed me was perfect. A renovated brownstone with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a private garden that faced east to catch the morning sun. The kitchen had granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet bigger than the room I'd been living in, and the price tag, $850,000, would send a clear message to anyone who still thought of me as a charity case. I put in an offer that afternoon, $20,000 over asking price, to ensure a quick acceptance. Patricia's eyes nearly popped out of her head, but she recovered quickly and assured me the sellers would likely accept immediately. They did. By 5 o'clock, I was signing preliminary paperwork for a house that cost more than most people made in a decade. The whole experience felt surreal, like stepping into a life I'd been watching from the outside for years. This was who I really was, a woman who could make six-figure decisions without blinking, who could transform her entire living situation with a few phone calls and a checkbook. Now came the harder part, telling my family. Section 6. The legal framework. While Patricia handled the real estate paperwork, I had James working on something far more complex. Withdrawing $4 million from a thriving business isn't something you do on impulse, no matter how satisfying the dramatic gesture might feel. Every move had to be calculated legal and absolutely bulletproof. The contracts I'd signed 5 years ago had been deliberately vague about my identity as an investor. To Anthony and Melissa, I was represented by something called the Martinez Investment Group, a name James had chosen specifically to avoid any connection to me despite sharing my surname. The beauty of the arrangement was that it had never technically been a family loan or gift. It was a legitimate business investment with clearly defined terms for withdrawal. James met me at a small coffee shop downtown the morning after my house hunting expedition. He'd brought a briefcase full of documents that would make a corporate lawyer weep with joy. Withdrawal notices, asset transfer forms, bank routing information for accounts. Anthony and Melissa didn't even know existed. Everything perfectly legal, everything designed to protect both them and me from any future complications. The 30-day notice period was standard in our original agreement, James explained, but given the circumstances, we could accelerate the timeline. The company was profitable, their contracts were solid, and they had other investors who might be willing to buy out my share. Of course, those other investors would charge much higher interest rates and demand more control over business decisions. But that would be Anthony and Melissa's problem to solve. What worried me wasn't the legality of the withdrawal, it was the aftermath. James had run the numbers, and without my investment, the company would need to restructure immediately. They'd probably have to let go of at least half their staff, downsize their office space, turn down larger contracts they couldn't handle with reduced resources, Everything Anthony had built would shrink back to something closer to what it had been in the beginning. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe my son needed to understand what his business was actually worth without his mother's hidden support. Maybe Melissa needed to see what their lifestyle looked like when it was based on their real income rather than my secret subsidies. James also brought something else information about Anthony and Melissa's personal finances that made my jaw tighten with anger. They'd been living far above their means for years, using the business profits to fund a lifestyle that included expensive cars, designer clothes, and vacations that cost more than most people's annual salaries. They'd assumed the money would keep flowing indefinitely, so they'd never bothered to save or invest or plan for any kind of financial uncertainty. My son, the man who thought his mother was too irresponsible to manage her own affairs, had been spending my money like a lottery winner, with no concept of tomorrow. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. Here I was, a woman who had turned a modest inheritance into an 8-figure portfolio through careful planning and disciplined investing, being lectured about financial responsibility by people who couldn't balance their own checkbook without my help. Well, they were about to get a very expensive education in cause and effect. Section 7, Finding My Sanctuary. The papers were signed, the deposit transferred, and suddenly I owned a piece of Kansas City that felt like stepping into a completely different life. While James handled the business side of my transformation, I threw myself into planning what my new home would look like. For the first time in decades, I could make choices based purely on what I wanted, not what was practical or what others expected from a woman my age. I hired an interior designer, something I'd never allowed myself to do, even when I could easily afford it. Sarah Chen was a young woman with an eye for mixing vintage pieces with modern comfort, and she understood immediately what I was trying to achieve. Not ostentation, but authenticity. Spaces that reflected the person I'd always been underneath the carefully constructed facade of simplicity. The garden was my priority. The previous owners had neglected it, leaving behind an overgrown tangle of weeds and dead plants, but I could see its potential. I spent hours walking the space, imagining where I'd place the herb garden, which corner would be perfect for morning coffee, how the evening light would hit the proposed seating area. This wouldn't be the small patch of vegetables I'd tended behind Anthony's house. This would be a proper garden, the kind I dreamed about for years. I hired a landscape architect, another first. Marcus Rivera listened to my vision with the kind of professional respect I'd forgotten existed. He didn't talk down to me or suggest that maybe I should start with something smaller, more manageable for someone my age. Instead, he pulled out his sketch pad and began drawing the garden of my dreams. Meanwhile, I was quietly preparing for the conversations that would inevitably come. Anthony and Melissa still had no idea about the house, though they'd certainly noticed the increased number of phone calls and mysterious errands. I told them I was handling some paperwork related to their father's estate, not entirely a lie, since I was restructuring my will to reflect my new circumstances. Lily, my granddaughter, was the only one who seemed to sense something significant was happening. At 21, she had her father's intuition, but her generation's comfort with change and complexity. She'd always been closer to me than to her parents, perhaps, because I'd never tried to control or lecture her the way they did. When she asked if I was okay, really okay after the party incident, I could see she was prepared for an honest answer. I wasn't ready to tell her everything yet, but I promised her that changes were coming, good changes. She squeezed my hand and told me she trusted me to know what was best for myself. The faith in her voice almost brought me to tears. At least one person in this family still believed I was capable of making my own decisions. The moving date was set for 2 weeks away. I timed it to coincide with the business withdrawal, so Anthony and Melissa would have to deal with both revelations simultaneously. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was efficiency. Better to rip off the bandage all at once than to drag out the pain over months of partial revelations and awkward conversations. Besides, I was tired of living in pieces, showing different parts of myself to different people depending on what I thought they could handle. It was time to be whole again, even if it meant some people might not recognize the woman I'd been hiding all these years. The countdown had begun. 3 days before my planned revelation, Lily knocked on my bedroom door with 2 cups of tea and an expression that reminded me so much of myself at her age, determined, perceptive, and absolutely unwilling to be brushed off with platitudes. She'd inherited my stubborn streak, along with my dark eyes, and right now both were focused on me with laser-like intensity. She settled cross-legged on my bed, something her parents had always discouraged as improper, and handed me the steaming mug. The tea was perfect, not too strong, just a touch of honey. She'd been paying attention to my preferences for years, I realized, in ways that the adults in this house never had. "Grandma B," she said quietly, "I know something's happening. The way you've been taking all these phone calls, the way you disappear for hours without explaining where you've been. And Mom's been acting weird since the party, like she's waiting for the other shoe to drop." I studied her face, seeing so much of my younger self in her features. Lily had always been the observer in the family, the one who noticed things others missed. She'd been the one to comfort me after Melissa's public humiliation, staying behind to help me clean up the scattered appetizers while the adults retreated to damage control mode. She'd seen her mother push me, even if no one else wanted to acknowledge it. The truth was, I'd been planning to tell Lily everything anyway. She deserved to know, partly because she'd always treated me with respect, and partly because my plans would affect her future in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The scholarship fund I was establishing would cover not just her remaining college expenses, but graduate school too if she wanted it. She'd never have to worry about student loans or choosing between her dreams and financial reality. But sitting there looking at her earnest face, I realized she wasn't asking about money or houses or business investments. She was asking if I was okay, if I was safe, if the grandmother she'd always known was still there underneath whatever transformation was taking place. So I told her about the garden first, about the house with the morning light, in the kitchen where I could cook whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted it, about having space for my books, my photography equipment that had been stored in boxes for years, my piano that had been sold when I'd moved in here because there wasn't room for it. Her eyes widened as I described the life I was planning, but not with shock, with excitement. She asked questions about the neighborhood, about whether I'd have room for guests, about the timeline for moving. It struck me that she was the first person to respond to my plans with curiosity, rather than suspicion or judgment. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "But Grandma, how can you afford all this?" I took a long sip of tea, buying myself time to choose the right words. The full truth would come out soon enough, but Lily deserved to hear it from me first in my own words, without the drama and accusations that would inevitably accompany the family revelation. That's when I began to tell her about the woman her grandmother had always been, but had chosen to keep hidden. About building something significant, something lasting, something that could take care of the people I loved long after I was gone. Her smile, when understanding finally dawned, was worth every year of secrets. The day I'd been planning for arrived with typical Kansas City unpredictability, a spring thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the emotional tempest I was about to unleash. I'd chosen a Saturday morning for the conversation when Anthony and Melissa would both be home, probably sleeping late, after their usual Friday night out with friends who would soon discover their social circle was about to shift dramatically. I made coffee in their kitchen one last time, using the expensive beans Melissa always bought, but somehow never seemed to notice I was the one who actually brewed them perfectly every morning. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd be delivering life-changing news while standing next to a coffee maker that cost more than some people's monthly rent. A coffee maker purchased with my money, though they'd never made that connection. Lily had offered to be there for moral support, but I declined. This was something I needed to do alone, partly for my own dignity, and partly because I didn't want her caught in the crossfire of her parents' inevitable reaction. She'd already promised to help me move my belongings to the new house later that day, after the dust settled from whatever explosion was about to occur. Anthony appeared first, shuffling into the kitchen in his expensive pajamas, with the kind of bedhead that only comes from sleeping off too much wine. He barely grunted a greeting as he reached for the coffee I'd prepared, still operating under the assumption that his mother existed primarily to make his life more convenient. Melissa followed 20 minutes later, already dressed in designer activewear that cost more per outfit than I'd been spending on clothes per year. She'd been avoiding eye contact with me since the party, which had actually made the last few days easier. No forced conversations, no pretending we were a happy family, no exhausting myself trying to win approval from someone who'd already decided I was worthless. I waited until they were both caffeinated and somewhat alert, then placed a manila envelope on the kitchen island between us. The papers inside represented months of legal work, financial restructuring, and careful planning. But to them, it would look like their world ending on a Saturday morning in their designer kitchen. I told them simply that I'd made some decisions about my living situation and my financial arrangements, that I'd purchased a house and would be moving out immediately, that I'd also decided to withdraw my investment from their company effective in 30 days, as stipulated in the original agreement. The silence that followed was deafening. Anthony stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. Melissa's face went through several color changes, settling on a pale green that reminded me unpleasantly of overcooked vegetables. Then the questions started coming fast and desperate. What investment? What agreement? What did I mean? I'd purchased a house. Where was I getting this money? Who was advising me? Was I being scammed by some financial predator targeting vulnerable seniors? The assumption that I must be the victim of some elaborate con game was almost insulting, but not surprising. In their minds, there was simply no scenario where the old woman who darned socks and clipped coupons could be making independent financial decisions involving millions of dollars. That's when I opened the envelope and spread the papers across their granite countertop, each document bearing my real name, my real signature, my real net worth, bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, the paper trail of a life they'd never bothered to investigate or understand. Anthony picked up the first page with shaking hands, his eyes scanning numbers that didn't make sense in the context of everything he thought he knew about his mother. The kitchen fell so quiet, I could hear the coffee maker's automatic shut-off click in the background. Anthony was still staring at the bank statement in his hands, his finger tracing the balance line, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more comprehensible. $8.7 million in liquid assets, not counting the real estate holdings or the retirement accounts or the trust funds I'd established years ago. Melissa had gone completely still, like a deer sensing a predator. Her usual animated gestures had frozen midair, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. I could practically see her mental calculator working, adding up every cruel word she'd spoken, every dismissive comment, every time she'd made me feel small and unwanted, in what she'd assumed was their house, supported by their charity. Anthony finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom," he said, as if testing the word, as if unsure I was still the same person who'd raised him. "How long have you had this money? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you needed our help?" The hurt in his voice was genuine, and for a moment, I almost wavered in my resolve. This was my son, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose dreams I'd nurtured. But he was also the man who'd stood by, silently, while his wife humiliated me in front of strangers, who'd never once questioned whether his mother might be more than she appeared. I told him the truth, then all of it, about building my portfolio while staying married to his father, about choosing to keep my success quiet to protect our family dynamic, about the anonymous investments that had funded his entire business empire, about watching him take credit for achievements that were built on my foundation, about letting him feel proud of supporting a mother who was actually supporting him. With each revelation, Melissa's face grew paler. She'd finally set down her coffee cup, but her hands were shaking so badly I worried she might drop it. The woman who'd called me a failure and a leech was slowly realizing she'd been living in a house made possible by my money-driving cars, purchased with my investment returns, wearing clothes bought with profits from a company I'd funded. The most devastating moment came when I pulled out the partnership agreement, the document that legally established my role as primary investor in their business. Anthony read it twice before the implications sank in. Everything he'd thought he'd built, every success he'd celebrated, every milestone he'd achieved, all of it had been underwritten by the woman he'd allowed his wife to treat like a burden. Melissa finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "The Martinez Investment Group. That's you. All this time, that's been you." I confirmed what she'd already figured out. Every quarterly payment, every capital injection that had saved them during lean months, every mysterious investor meeting that Anthony had attended downtown, all of it traced back to me. Their silent partner wasn't a faceless corporation or wealthy stranger. It was the old woman they'd taken for granted, the one who cooked their meals and tended their garden and asked for nothing in return except basic human dignity. The weight of that realization seemed to crush something in both of them. Anthony sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Melissa just stood there, tears finally starting to fall. Though whether they were tears of shame or fear or simple shock, I couldn't tell. I gathered up the papers and returned them to the envelope. The conversation was over. The truth was out. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. The moving truck arrived at exactly 9 a.m., 3 hours after my revelation in the kitchen. I timed everything deliberately. The movers, the final walkthrough of my new house, even the grocery delivery that would stock my new kitchen with food I'd actually chosen for myself. After years of careful planning, I wasn't about to let the execution be anything less than flawless. Lily had arrived early with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, the good ones that cost $12 a box and tasted like actual butter instead of chemicals. She'd also brought her boyfriend, Marcus, a sweet engineering student who didn't ask questions about why we were moving her grandmother out of a perfectly nice house into an even nicer one across town. Sometimes the younger generation's acceptance of complexity was exactly what an old soul needed. Anthony and Melissa had made themselves scarce, which suited me perfectly. I could hear them upstairs having what sounded like an intense discussion, punctuated by long silences and occasional outbursts. Let them process. Let them figure out how to run their business without my money, how to maintain their lifestyle without my support, how to explain to their friends why their primary investor had suddenly vanished. The movers were efficient and respectful, treating my belongings like they mattered, instead of like the accumulated debris of an old woman who'd overstayed her welcome. My books, my photo albums, my grandmother's china that had been packed away in boxes because there wasn't room for it in Melissa's minimalist dining room. Everything found its way carefully into labeled boxes and protective wrapping. I saved my piano for last. Not the small electric keyboard I'd been using, but my real piano, the baby grand that had been in storage for 3 years. I'd sold my previous one when I moved in with Anthony, convincing myself that sacrificing my music was a small price to pay for being close to family. But the new house had a perfect spot for it, by the front windows where morning light would dance across the keys while I played. Lily watched the piano movers with wide eyes, probably trying to calculate what it cost to store and move an instrument like that for years. She was starting to understand that her grandmother's hidden resources went far beyond a comfortable retirement account. This was generational wealth, the kind that could change lives and create opportunities that most people could only dream about. The last box contained my gardening tools and the small potted plants I'd been nurturing on the back porch. Nothing fancy herbs mostly, and a few flowers that I'd been coaxing to bloom despite the less than ideal growing conditions. But they were mine, tended by my hands, and they would help make the new house feel like home from the very first day. As we loaded my car with the final odds and ends, Anthony appeared in the doorway. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past few hours, his hair disheveled and his expensive shirt wrinkled from whatever emotional wrestling match had been happening upstairs. He didn't try to stop me or argue or demand explanations. He just stood there watching his mother disappear from his life with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I considered saying something comforting, something that would ease the transition for him. But this wasn't about making things easier for Anthony. This was about teaching him that actions have consequences, that respect isn't automatic, and that even the people who love you most have limits. I gave him a small nod and drove away, following the moving truck toward my new life. The first week in my new house passed in a blur of unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting acquainted with my neighborhood. The morning light was everything I'd hoped for, streaming through the large windows and making even my coffee cup look elegant. The garden was responding beautifully to professional care. Marcus Rivera's crew had worked miracles in just a few days, transforming the neglected space into something that looked like it belonged in a home and garden magazine. But the real work was happening in James's office downtown, where we were finalizing the details of something I'd been planning for months, the Eleanor Martinez Educational Foundation. Not named after me, of course. I'd chosen to use my maiden name, Rivera, to maintain some distance from the family drama that was still unfolding across town. The foundation would provide full scholarships to first-generation college students, covering not just tuition, but also housing, books, and living expenses. I'd seen too many bright young people derailed by financial stress, forced to choose between their education and their family's immediate needs. This fund would eliminate that choice for at least 20 students per year forever. Lily would be the first recipient, though she didn't know it yet. Her parents had been paying her college expenses, assuming their business profits would continue indefinitely. With my investment withdrawn, those assumptions were looking increasingly shaky. But Lily wouldn't suffer for her parents' financial miscalculations. She'd have everything she needed to finish her degree and pursue graduate school if she wanted it. The beauty of the scholarship structure was that it would continue long after I was gone. The foundation would be managed by a professional board funded by an endowment that could grow and adapt to changing educational costs. It was a legacy that would matter, that would create opportunities for generations of students who might otherwise never get the chance to reach their potential. James had also helped me restructure my will ensuring that Lily would inherit enough to secure her future, while the bulk of my estate would go toward expanding the foundation's reach. Anthony would receive something. Of course, I wasn't cruel enough to disinherit my only child completely, but his inheritance would come with conditions, requirements that he demonstrate financial responsibility and genuine understanding of what he'd taken for granted for so long. The phone calls from Anthony and Melissa had started on day 3. First apologetic, then desperate, then angry. They discovered that their other investors were demanding much higher returns than I'd ever required, and that the terms of new partnership agreements were far less favorable than what they'd enjoyed with their mysterious, silent partner. Their business was still viable, but it would need to shrink dramatically and quickly. I listened to their voicemails, but didn't return the calls. Not yet. They needed time to fully understand the scope of their situation before we could have any meaningful conversation about the future. And honestly, I was enjoying the peace too much to invite their drama back into my daily life. Lily, on the other hand, was a constant presence. She'd taken to stopping by after her classes, ostensibly to help me settle in, but really just to spend time in a house where she could breathe freely. No criticism of her choices, no lectures about responsibility, no underlying tension that made every conversation feel like walking through a minefield. It was time to tell her about the scholarship fund and about what her future could look like with unlimited educational opportunities. 6 weeks after moving into my new house, I'd established routines that felt more authentic than anything I'd done in years. Morning coffee on the garden patio, reading the financial news on my tablet, while planning which sections of the yard to tackle next. Afternoon cooking sessions in my spacious kitchen, preparing meals that reflected my actual tastes rather than what I thought a family of 4 might want. Evening piano practice, my fingers slowly remembering pieces I'd played decades ago. Lily had practically moved in with me, though we pretended it was temporary. Her dorm room sat empty most nights while she claimed my guest bedroom, insisting she was just helping me adjust to living alone. The truth was simpler. We both thrived in each other's company, without the toxic dynamics that had poisoned the atmosphere at Anthony's house. She'd been stunned into silence when I'd explained the scholarship fund, then burst into tears when she realized what it meant for her future. No more choosing between textbooks and groceries, no more anxiety about whether her parents could afford the next semester's expenses, no more limiting her dreams to what seemed financially realistic. She could study abroad, pursue graduate school, take unpaid internships that would advance her career. All the opportunities that money normally buys were now hers without question. But what touched me most was her immediate question: what about other students? How many people will this help? She understood instinctively that the foundation was bigger than her own needs, bigger than our family, bigger than the petty grievances that had motivated its creation. She wanted to volunteer to help select recipients, to be part of something that would outlast all of us. The house itself was becoming exactly what I'd envisioned. The piano filled the front room with music that drifted through open windows into the garden. My library was finally properly organized with comfortable reading chairs and good lighting for the hours I spent absorbed in books I'd been meaning to read for years. The kitchen hosted dinner parties for new friends I was meeting through volunteer work at the local art center and community foundation. These were people who knew me only as Beatrice Martinez, the woman who'd made a generous donation to support music education programs, who'd quietly funded a new community garden in an underserved neighborhood, who showed up at board meetings with thoughtful questions and practical solutions. They had no idea about family drama or hidden identities or elaborate revenge schemes. To them, I was simply a woman who'd chosen to use her resources thoughtfully and they treated me with the respect that comes from recognizing genuine contribution rather than tolerating familial obligation. The calls from Anthony and Melissa had evolved from desperate to angry to resigned. Their business was surviving, but barely. They'd had to lay off half their staff, move to a smaller office, and turn down contracts they couldn't fulfill with reduced resources. Melissa had been forced to take a part-time job at a marketing firm downtown, working for someone else for the first time in years. Anthony was learning to handle client meetings and administrative tasks he'd previously delegated to employees they could no longer afford. Part of me felt guilty about their struggles, but a larger part recognized that this was exactly the education they'd needed. They were discovering what their business was actually worth without external subsidies, what their lifestyle actually cost without hidden support, what their relationship could withstand when stripped of assumptions and entitlements. The most encouraging sign was that they'd stopped demanding explanations and started asking questions about my background, my experience, my willingness to consider some kind of future relationship that acknowledged who I actually was rather than who they'd assumed me to be. I wasn't ready for those conversations yet, but at least they were finally asking the right questions. The doorbell rang on a crisp October morning, 3 months after I'd moved into my sanctuary. I was in the garden, deadheading the last of the summer roses and planning where to plant the spring bulbs that would announce my first full year in this house. Through the front window, I could see a familiar figure on my doorstep, Melissa holding a bouquet of expensive flowers and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Humility, maybe, or something close to it. I took my time answering the door, partly because my gardening gloves needed to come off, and partly because I wanted to observe her a little longer. She looked different, thinner, less polished, wearing clothes that were still nice, but not the designer pieces she'd favored when spending my money. Her hair was simpler too, probably styled at a regular salon instead of the high-end place she used to frequent. The changes suited her, actually made her look more human and less like a carefully constructed image. When I finally opened the door, she launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. An apology for her behavior at the party, an acknowledgement that she'd been wrong about my capabilities and contributions, an expression of gratitude for everything I'd done for their family over the years. The words were right, but they felt hollow, like lines she'd practiced in front of a mirror until they sounded convincing. I invited her in more out of curiosity than forgiveness. What did she want? What had Anthony told her to say? How far was she willing to go? To repair a relationship she'd worked so hard to damage. She admired the house with what seemed like genuine appreciation, commenting on the piano, the art I'd hung on the walls, the way the afternoon light filled the living room. But I could see her making calculations too, adding up the cost of everything she saw, probably wondering how much more money might be hidden behind the tasteful furnishings and careful design choices. The real conversation started when she sat down in my favorite chair, the one by the window, where I read every morning and began to cry. Not the dramatic tears she'd deployed at family gatherings when she wanted sympathy or attention, but quiet, exhausted sobs that seemed to come from somewhere genuine. She told me about the past 3 months, about watching their carefully constructed life fall apart, piece by piece. The stress of running a failing business, the humiliation of having to ask her parents for help with their mortgage, the slow realization that everything they'd thought they'd earned had actually been borrowed against my generosity. Anthony barely spoke to her anymore, she said, spending his days trying to salvage what was left of their company, and his evenings staring at financial statements that never balanced the way they used to. But what seemed to haunt her most was the memory of that party, of standing in front of her friends and describing me as a burden and a failure. She'd found out, she said, that several of those friends had been shocked by her cruelty, that some had stopped inviting her to social gatherings because they didn't want to be around someone who could be so vicious toward an elderly family member. The woman who thought she was performing for an appreciative audience had actually been destroying her own reputation, revealing herself to be exactly the kind of person that decent people avoid. I listened without commenting, letting her words fill the space between us, like smoke from a dying fire. When she finished, she looked at me with something approaching desperation and asked the question I'd been expecting. What would it take for me to consider reinvesting in their company? That's when I realized she still didn't understand what had really happened or why. I looked at Melissa sitting in my reading chair, tears streaming down her face, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a profound sadness for how much energy we'd all wasted on misunderstanding each other. She was asking about reinvestment, as if this had been a business decision, as if the right combination of apologies and promises could restore the financial arrangements that had propped up their lifestyle for years. I told her gently that she was asking the wrong question. This had never been about money, not really. It had been about respect, about dignity, about the fundamental human need to be seen and valued for who you actually are, rather than who others assume you to be. No amount of profit sharing or partnership restructuring could address the real issues that had brought us to this point. But I also told her something that seemed to surprise her, that I didn't regret the way things had unfolded. The past 3 months had been the most fulfilling of my adult life, filled with authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the simple joy of living according to my own values rather than others' expectations. I'd discovered volunteer opportunities that energized me, made friends who appreciated my contributions, and created a daily routine that reflected my actual interests and priorities. The Community Foundation had invited me to join their board of directors, recognizing my financial expertise and commitment to educational initiatives. I was working with local schools to develop financial literacy programs, sharing the knowledge I'd accumulated over decades of successful investing. The Art Center had asked me to help curate their upcoming exhibition on women entrepreneurs, a project that allowed me to research and celebrate stories of women who'd built something significant despite social barriers and family resistance. Every week brought new invitations, new projects, new ways to contribute that went far beyond writing checks. I was finally living as the person I'd always been, rather than the diminished version of myself I'd presented to keep peace in a family that had never really known me. Lily flourished in this environment, bringing friends over for dinner parties, where the conversation ranged from literature to politics to technology to art. She was majoring in nonprofit management now, inspired by watching the Scholarship Foundation take shape, planning a career that would let her create opportunities for others the way I'd created them for her. The transformation in her confidence and ambition was remarkable. She was becoming the woman she'd always had the potential to be, unencumbered by financial anxiety or family disapproval. When Melissa asked about Anthony, about whether I missed my son, I had to think carefully before answering. I did miss him, but I missed the person I'd hoped he might become, rather than the person he'd actually revealed himself to be. The son who would have protected his mother from public humiliation, who would have recognized her contributions, who would have valued her wisdom and experience, rather than treating her like a burden to be managed. That person might still exist somewhere, underneath the layers of entitlement and assumption that had accumulated over the years. But if Anthony wanted a relationship with his mother, he'd have to do the work of becoming someone worthy of that relationship. He'd have to learn to see me clearly, to acknowledge what he'd overlooked, to understand that love without respect isn't really love at all. I told Melissa she was welcome to visit occasionally, but that our conversation was ending there. The past was settled. The future would depend entirely on whether my son could figure out how to be the man I'd raised him to be. A year after moving into my house, I hosted my first proper holiday dinner. Not the tense family obligations I'd endured for years, but a celebration of the life I'd chosen to build. The dining room table extended to its full length, seated 12 people who actually wanted to be there. Lily and Marcus, who'd gotten engaged over the summer. 3 scholarship recipients who'd become like adopted grandchildren. My fellow board members from the community foundation. Neighbors who'd become genuine friends. And James, who'd finally accepted my invitation to join a social gathering rather than just handling my business affairs. The menu reflected my actual tastes rather than what I thought others expected: Mediterranean dishes with bold flavors, wine that cost more than $20 a bottle, desserts that prioritized quality over quantity. Everything was served on my grandmother's china, which hadn't seen proper use in over a decade, but now graced my table several times a month. Anthony had called that morning, the first time we'd spoken directly since the revelation 10 months earlier. His voice was different, quieter, more uncertain, stripped of the casual confidence that had characterized our previous conversations. He asked if he could visit sometime soon, just to talk, just to understand what had happened to the family he thought he'd known. I told him I'd consider it, which was true. But I also told him that any conversation we had would need to acknowledge reality, rather than the convenient fiction we'd all been living. If he wanted to know his mother, he'd have to be prepared to meet the woman I actually was, rather than the diminished version he'd been comfortable with for so long. The most remarkable change was how natural it felt to live without pretense. When new acquaintances asked about my background, I could mention my investment portfolio, my business experience, my philanthropic work without worrying about how the information would shift their perception of me. When financial questions came up at board meetings, I could offer insights based on decades of real experience rather than deflecting or deferring to others who knew less than I did about wealth management and strategic giving.